I've always believed that evil wears a mask of normalcy. It doesn't come knocking in the night or scream through the dark. Sometimes, it wears a lab coat. My name isn't important, but for the last 10 years I've covered cases most people would rather forget. Murders, disappearances, the occasional cold case that somehow finds its way back into the light. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I uncovered inside the walls of one of America's most respected institutions, a place built on knowledge, science, and trust. Harvard, well, not that Harvard in this story. Let's call it Eastborough Medical College, a name that sounds prestigious enough to hide anything behind it. Because in 2023, behind its clean white halls and perfectly polished ethics, someone was committing one of the most disturbing crimes in modern history. And it all started in the basement. The man at the center of it all was Dr. Simon Grant. To anyone on the outside, he looked like the definition of professionalism. Mid-50s, calm voice, always the first to arrive, always the last to leave. He'd worked at Eastborough's anatomical gift program for nearly 3 decades. The kind of man who remembered students' names, who helped grieving families fill out the paperwork when their loved ones were donated to science. He wasn't just a morgue manager, he was the gatekeeper, the one who handled what most of us can't even bear to imagine. Bodies, organs, the quiet, solemn promise of medical progress. But beneath the surface, that promise was rotting. For years, whispers had drifted around the anatomy department. Odd discrepancies in the inventory logs. Families calling to ask why they hadn't received the ashes they were promised. Students noticing that certain cadavers disappeared from cold storage earlier than scheduled. Nobody asked too many questions. After all, it was Eastborough. Who would dare accuse them of anything unethical? But on March 12, 2023, someone did. Her name was Lena Morales, a second-year pathology student. She was the kind of student who didn't just memorize anatomy. She felt it. Meticulous, curious, often the last one to leave the lab. That evening, she'd stayed late to prepare for her midterm. She logged into the access terminal to review specimen records, something routine. But one of the entries caught her eye. A body labeled EB2451 listed as transferred for external study, except there was no record of which institution it had been transferred to. And worse, the name associated with the donor? It was her former high school biology teacher, Mr. Hennings, who'd passed away 2 years earlier. Lena froze. Her own signature was listed as the approving technician, but she'd never seen that file before. She printed the page and took it straight to the head administrator. By morning, the file was gone. And by Monday, so was Lena. I remember the first time I heard about her disappearance. The police called it an unresolved missing persons case. No signs of struggle, no ransom, no body. She'd simply vanished, her apartment untouched, her phone turned off, her car still parked at the university lot. But what stood out most was her last text message, sent to a classmate at 11:47 p.m. the night before she disappeared. It read, "If I don't show up tomorrow, check the basement logs." The text had never been deleted. It wasn't until months later that the real investigation began. Not because of Lena, not even because of the missing donors. It began because of an online shipment flagged by US Customs, labeled as antique medical specimens. Inside were 4 human skulls, each tagged with partial barcodes that matched Eastborough's database. And the sender, a name familiar to anyone who'd ever worked in the anatomy department: Simon Grant. When agents searched his home in a quiet Massachusetts suburb, they found what the media would later call a house of horrors. In his garage, rows of labeled jars, organ fragments preserved in formalin, human bones stacked in moving boxes, even wrapped parcels ready to ship. On his computer, emails, transaction histories, private message threads. He'd been selling remains through online collector groups, to hobbyists, to artists, to people who thought they were buying legally sourced specimens. But some buyers knew exactly what they were getting. The money trail led across several states, reaching into a bizarre online community obsessed with authentic relics of mortality. Dark corners of the internet where the human body was treated as a collectible, where empathy went to die. Grant wasn't alone. His wife, Marianne, had been helping him catalogue and photograph the pieces. They'd built an entire business out of stolen trust, out of other people's loved ones. When confronted, Simon didn't deny it. He said something that chilled investigators to their bones. "I only took what would have been discarded anyway." The prosecutors called it a betrayal of the dead. The families called it unforgivable. But when I started digging into the old files Lena had flagged months before, I realized the story went even deeper. Simon's logs went back years, maybe decades. Bodies marked as disposed, transferred, damaged in transport. Hundreds of entries, all tied to missing paperwork, falsified cremation receipts, and non-existent transfers. Every one of them had passed through Simon's hands. It would have been simple to see this as greed, a man exploiting his access for money. But there was something else, something darker in his tone during the interviews. Witnesses described him as calm, detached, clinical, as if what he'd done wasn't criminal, but inevitable. One student recalled seeing him late one night, alone in the morgue. He was standing over a dissection table, talking softly to a cadaver. She said he whispered, "They forget you're still here." She thought he was just eccentric. Now she's not so sure. By summer, Eastborough's name was all over the headlines, but internally the university was panicking. They didn't just lose a staff member, they lost their reputation. A reputation built on trust, honor, and the sanctity of donation. They issued a public statement condemning the crimes, but never once mentioned Lena Morales. To them, she was still missing, but when I visited her apartment 6 months later, her roommate showed me something the police had overlooked. A manila envelope labeled "For the Record." Inside were copies of donor transfer forms, each one bearing Simon Grant's forged signature, and a note scribbled in her handwriting, "He's not selling for money. He's preserving what he thinks should never die." I still remember standing there, reading those words under the flicker of a dying lamp bulb. Because for the first time, I began to understand what Lena might have discovered. Simon Grant didn't just steal human remains. He believed he was saving them from decomposition, from anonymity, from being forgotten. To him, every body was a story that deserved to keep existing. And in his mind, he was the storyteller. The case spiraled into chaos, public outrage, families demanding answers, the media calling it the Eastborough Morgue scandal. But behind the headlines, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Simon's meticulous logs, the missing bodies, and Lena's disappearance just days after uncovering the same records. I went through every transcript of his interrogation, every line, every pause, every word. And buried halfway through one of the sessions, Simon said something that never made it into the final report. "She came to see me that night. She said the dead were restless." I told her. They already knew her name. That line haunted me, because the timestamp on the interview matched the exact night Lena vanished. Was it a coincidence, or was Simon trying to tell investigators that she was one of them now, one of the preserved? There was no proof. No remains were ever identified as hers. But in his basement logs, next to entry EB2451, there's a handwritten note. "Return to sender," and that's where part 1 ends. Because when I tell you what they found in Simon's private storage locker, you'll understand why this story still keeps me up at night. I didn't sleep much after reading those words. Return to sender. It was the kind of phrase that sticks under your skin, not loud, not obvious, just wrong. Like a secret whispered through a locked door. I kept wondering what it meant. Was Simon Grant mocking the system that trusted him? Or was he trying to say something else, something only he understood? The deeper I went into his case files, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a crime, it was a philosophy. Simon's storage locker sat 3 towns over, in a small, privately owned facility near the outskirts of Duxbury. He'd rented it under his middle name Elias and paid in cash every month for years. When the FBI finally gained access, they expected to find more stolen remains. Instead, what they found was something that defied logic. Rows of shelves lined the narrow corridor, each carefully labeled by year. Jars, boxes, handwritten journals. But what caught their attention wasn't the evidence, it was the walls. Every inch of that space was covered in photographs. Hundreds of them. Faded Polaroids pinned side by side, faces of donors, clipped from obituary pages and family newsletters. And below each one, written in the same steady handwriting, they gave themselves to science. I gave them immortality. The discovery reignited the national firestorm. Media outlets tore into every angle the breach of ethics, the lack of oversight, the horror of it all. But I couldn't stop thinking about Lina Morales. Because among those Polaroids, investigators found one picture that didn't belong. A woman in a white lab coat standing beside Simon in the morgue. The timestamp matched the night before she disappeared. And though the photo was slightly blurred, the face was unmistakable. It was Lina, smiling. For months, that image consumed me. How could she look calm, even happy, if she'd discovered his crimes? Was she coerced? Complicit? Or did she believe him? The official reports never said. But one night, after requesting case access through a contact at the Department of Justice, I found something buried in the digital evidence logs. An audio recording labeled simply Locker Tape 03. No transcript, no summary. It began with the creak of a metal door, then a voice calm, distant, unmistakably Simon's. Do you see it now, Lina? They're not gone. They're waiting. A pause, the sound of glass clinking. A quiet shuffle, then her voice trembling. This isn't preservation, this is desecration. No, he said, this is devotion. The rest was muffled, but the last line before the tape cut out still echoes in my head. Don't worry. You'll understand soon enough. Police never confirmed where or how that recording was made. But less than 48 hours later, Simon and his wife were arrested outside their home. The charges read like a nightmare. Interstate trafficking of human remains, theft, conspiracy, abuse of a corpse, fraud. And yet, in every photograph from the trial, Simon looked serene, unbothered, almost proud. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he didn't plead for mercy. He simply said, I honored what the living forgot to cherish. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His wife received 30 years. But the story didn't end there, because even after his conviction, pieces of his past kept surfacing quite literally. In 2024, a construction crew renovating a decommissioned storage site on the Eastborough campus unearthed a sealed freezer unit beneath the floorboards. Inside were 12 human hearts, perfectly preserved, each tagged with handwritten notes bearing only initials and dates. Among them LM/0, 3.1, 3.23. Lina Morales. The autopsy was inconclusive. The remains were too damaged to confirm with certainty. But investigators did find traces of a chemical compound unique to the preservation formula Simon used, a formula he'd developed himself, the same mixture found on every other specimen in his possession. I reached out to the lead detective on the case. He told me, off the record, if you ask me, he didn't kill for pleasure. He killed for permanence. That line haunted me as I pieced together the rest of the investigation. Because it wasn't just about science gone wrong, it was about obsession, a god complex hidden beneath years of quiet professionalism. Simon saw himself as a curator of humanity, a keeper of stories. But in his pursuit of eternal preservation, he erased the one thing that truly mattered, life itself. Months passed. Eastborough tried to rebuild. They replaced staff, issued new ethics protocols, renamed the donation program. But no matter how many statements they released, the trust was gone. Families who had once seen donation as a noble act now felt betrayed. Some even demanded their loved ones' remains back only to discover that no complete records existed. Simon's meticulous logs had been altered, cross-coded, some even deliberately destroyed. It was as if he'd wanted the lines between science and sin to blur forever. I attended one of the hearings where families testified about the emotional toll. A woman stood up, clutching a photograph of her late father. She said, he wanted to teach the next generation, not end up in someone's collection. There was no answer for that, no apology that could erase what had been done. The university's representative could barely speak through tears. And in that silence, I realized something chilling. Simon Grant had achieved exactly what he wanted. He'd made sure they would never forget him. Never forget them. Weeks later, I visited the Duxbury locker myself. The facility was empty, its units cleared, locks replaced. But on one wall behind where the shelves had been, faint outlines of the Polaroids remained. sun-bleached silhouettes of faces long gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space, trying to understand what drove a man like Simon to cross such a line. Maybe it was arrogance, maybe madness, or maybe deep down he believed he was the only one capable of giving the dead what the living never could: permanence. A year after his sentencing, Simon sent a letter from prison. It was addressed to the families of the donors, but somehow it found its way to me. No return address, just a single page, typed in his usual precision. It read, "The body is only temporary, the story is eternal. If you found the 13th heart, then you already know the truth. But there were only 12 hearts in that freezer, at least according to the official report." I tried to confirm through the FBI evidence list, but the file had been sealed. When I asked a source within the bureau, she hesitated before saying, "Don't look for what isn't meant to be found." I thought she was just being cryptic until I received a package at my office 2 weeks later. No return name, just a padded envelope with a small silver key inside. Attached was a note: Unit 41, Eastborough Storage. Returned to sender. When I arrived, Unit 41 had already been emptied by order of the university, but on the concrete floor, etched faintly into the dust, was a set of initials: LM. And below it one more phrase: "He said we'd never die." Even now I can't tell you what to believe, whether Lena was a victim or a believer, whether Simon was insane or simply the mirror of what happens when devotion turns to obsession. The official record ends with his conviction, but unofficially there are still missing donor files, still unaccounted specimens, still buyers who vanished after the story broke. And sometimes when I think about the 13th heart, I wonder if it ever stopped beating. They say every act of science begins with curiosity. But curiosity, when left unchecked, can rot into something monstrous. In the case of Eastborough Medical College, it wasn't the dead we needed to fear. It was the living, the ones who believe they have the right to decide what happens after the final breath. Because trust, once broken, can never truly be restored. And as I close this story, I can't help but feel that somewhere, in some quiet, sterile basement, another gatekeeper is already waiting.